Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 34 or 33. Yagi paused in writing the email on his screen as he watched Aizawa take a seat at his desk across from him, coffee set gently on the neatly organized surface. A thick stack of papers was placed next to it. He isn't sure how to bring up his concerns in a way that wouldn't warrant the others trying to set aside their work. They were all in crunch time for midterm prep. Aizawa got through 5 pages with the red pen scratching away by the time Yagi settled on it.
Midoriya-kun is behaving strangely as of late,
he said quietly. He glanced over to see Aizawa's pen had stopped mid-strike-through. Yamada had pulled a headphone back as well.
As he seemed to be trying especially hard to win approval, like he is working to dig out the words and be told he is doing anything correctly in new classes. Or at home?
He asked without taking his eyes off the screen. It was a strange expression of a drive he feared he knew all too well. There's only so much one individual can take alone, after all.
I fear something is breaking in him. I don't know what, and he is trying to hide it.
He finished. Aizawa took a breath as he wrote something on a sticky note to the side. Yagi returned to his email. Yamada's shoulders slumped momentarily before he stood up and left the lounge. We have to catch this sooner than later. Izuku is going to do something dangerous, knowingly or not, if we don't. Yagi kept an eye on the tally that the 3 of them were building. Multiple groups of multiple kinds. All of them the general ways Izuku was doubling down on different aspects and behaviors. The specifics giving a glimpse of the way he was chipping away and fracturing without allowing anyone to step in without pushing them away. He was clearly covering up his distress more desperately than ever. Even his classmates were taking notice. Aizawa grumbled away in the group chat about how Nezu had posed his initial request to have Izuku start training in his tutelary form, and how he was thinking it would be a coin toss on how it turned out. They all were hesitant. Yagi's position was that it would actually be the last flag they could take in on how Izuku was treating himself. If he hesitated but cautiously agreed, he wasn't too far into his own self-destruction. If he just agreed without thought, though, then they would have to step in somehow. It did not go the way he had hoped. Aizawa reported that he had even suggested people he could train with, looking so much like he was straining for some approval that wasn't being withheld in the first place. He explained that even when he tried to say that Izuku could slow down, pace himself, he got brushed off. The small smiles most of them knew of at this point looked too large, too fake, and far too pleading. When Izuku approached him after school one day of his own volition, Yagi wanted so badly to just ask flat out, but all previous attempts had been avoided completely.
Could you show me how to cook, Yagi-san? I want to learn.
Of course, my boy.
Anything you want, please just tell me what's going on. It was a Sunday when the breaking point hit. It was always something Aizawa found acutely fascinating, how the breaking point is often the smallest of nudges. Izuku had insisted on cooking a small meal for himself for lunch. Aizawa watched how there must have been some sort of small thing that was bothering him about the process. They had gone to the store, and Izuku gingerly picked out items from a list on his phone as Aizawa carried the basket. They had still been working on buying more than a few items, but the fact that the basket was even nabbed in the first place was growth prior to whatever was under Izuku's skin now. It had been seeming to go smoothly until Izuku had started to dice some of his veggie selection. He moved his grating to sitting on the counter next to the sink. He wanted to at least be in the same room so that Izuku could ask him for something if he needed to. If he wanted to. He kept his eyes off of Izuku, setting aside the grated sheets as he went, steadily going through his pile. The motions Izuku was going through were something he fully recognized and understood. Aizawa let him be for a few moments more, but the moment Izuku made an involuntary grumble, he set aside the rest of it.
If you would like a hand, I'm fully willing to—
No! Izuku bit out more harshly than he intended, if how he dropped the knife was any indication. Izuku jumped back as Aizawa lurched forward. The knife bounced off the edge of a plate and sent both across the floor, plate shattering on impact. The silence after the knife stopped bouncing did not last long. The muttering was repetitive but indistinct. He saw the tears hitting the floor more than he heard any crying.
Izuku?
Aizawa held a hand out as he approached, stepping around the shards of ceramic gingerly.
No, 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 no.
He repeated on under his breath as he crouched and started to shakily pick up the closest shard. Aizawa saw the way it sliced without spilling any blood. Small sparks rising from his skin at the edge of unglazed ceramic turned a dark pink. He grabbed Izuku's wrists and pulled the shard away gently.
I'm sorry, I can...
Midoriya, slow down.
He kept his grip on his wrist as he set the shard out of Izuku's reach and watched him carefully. He swept one leg under himself to be sure there weren't pieces under him as he sat down.
It's okay. These things just happen sometimes. It was an accident.
No, I have to be doing good. I can't not be doing good. I can't not.
Izuku's eyes weren't focused, and Aizawa noticed that the sparks weren't going away either. He didn't know what Izuku was grabbing, but it wasn't from him, and it wasn't on skin he could see.
You don't have to be perfectly good, kid. You have been plenty good without working yourself to death on whatever you're doing.
He took a hold of Izuku's other wrist, putting his thumbs over the pulse point on both.
I do! You don't understand! You don't understand! You don't!
The quiet and muted hysterics were polarizing. It was like watching a wreck with the sound off. You knew there should be more violence, but half of the input was gone.
I can clean it! I'm sorry, sir! I'm sorry! Just let me! Please!
The tug was weak. He knew how strong Izuku could be, but there was no will in the attempt to pull away. He was shivering.
You need to slow down and breathe first, Midoriya. You're just going to cut yourself again with how badly you're shaking.
It doesn't matter.
Yes, it does.
Aizawa gripped his wrists a bit more firmly.
I have to fix it.
Izuku tried again, tears still falling, voice still quivering.
You still need to slow down first.
I have to fix it.
Why?
That made Izuku pull back with a bit more force. It wasn't enough to break Aizawa's grip. It probably could have been considered more of a physical recoil than anything. The sparks fizzled out. The shaking got worse. The tears stayed silent, trained into secrecy, seclusion, isolation.
Why do you have to fix it, Izuku?
He tried again.
I have to make up for it.
Izuku eventually got out.
For what?
Aizawa was careful with how he pressed, purposefully vague. He wanted answers, of course he did, but he couldn't pry them out. He couldn't risk it. He didn't want this to actually push Izuku further from the people he was starting to trust. There couldn't be a setback. He wasn't sure Izuku could survive a setback further than this.
All these horrid thoughts. I've been so horrible, and I don't deserve any of this. I'm sorry, I'm just using everyone, and I can't even do anything to make this not as bad. I don't deserve any of it, and I don't know how to fix it to be a good person. I have to make up for it, please.
Okay, I can work with this. Aizawa felt how Izuku's pulse was starting to edge its way down. He pet the kid's wrists gently with his thumbs.
We've been over the thoughts thing before, yes? It's okay to have horrible or angry, even vicious thoughts. It's okay. It's a way to let off steam when you vent internally. There are healthy and unhealthy ways to do it, though. Getting stuck on them, ruminating until it's spiraling, and all that you can think of to the point of scaring yourself with them isn't a healthy way. You're only hurting yourself.
He paused before continuing.
I get violent thoughts too. Some more impulsive than others. I'm confident that if you ask Yagi-san or Zashi or Nomori, that they will also have had similar experiences. The intrusive ideas and thoughts you get do not make you a bad kid.
Izuku's hands balled up, pulse spiking again.
But I have to be good,
he insisted.
And why is that?
Izuku looked up at him then, tears streaming fat and heavy down his face, breath almost visibly shaking.
So she can come back and I can say, I'm sorry, I wasn't good enough to stay.
His voice cracked hard on the last word. Aizawa could only watch as that crack in his voice became a break elsewhere he couldn't define. This wasn't something mere words would be fixing. It wasn't something anyone could patch for Izuku either. He let go of Izuku's wrists and carefully pulled him to his chest. He kept his grip firm, secure. Yet if Izuku had started to pull away, Aizawa would have let him in an instant. Instead, though, Izuku curled up, not holding on to anything other than himself, and stayed seated in Aizawa's lap. His tears stayed silent. Aizawa kept his hold steady as he watched the empty hall just outside the kitchen, head resting on Izuku's. Namori was reclining on a couch brushing through Sushi's fur with a de-shedding comb as the old beast purred away. She had roughly an hour until their patrol was supposed to start, but one couldn't deny the simple pleasures of a four-legged companion. Her phone buzzed on the arm behind her. There were a number of texts and notifications she got regularly, being in the amount of group chats she liked to reside in, but this one had her setting a brush aside. "Oh, and what do you think our little Shota has to say on this fine evening, Sushi?" She ran a hand over the couch cushion to collect the fur as she unlocked her screen. Her smile turned into something a little more cautious as she read the message.
Shota, please, no jokes, but where do you get your polished stones for your gardening? I know you do your stuff locally.
Nemu. Okay, no jokes, but why the interest? It's from that tiny shop called Shi Aotsuki, over by Hizashi's old station, by the way.
Shota. I just know you have the stones more readily in mind than looking it up. Thank you.
Nemu. What's it even from?
Shota. The project I'm working on.
Nemu. Okay, but different stones have different durabilities and pressure resistances, so what's the project? I can give you some ideas other than just granite like everyone resorts to. What kind of plant also needs different stones because the stone may have calcium, which neutralizes soil?
Shota. I'm not starting a garden. I just need a durable, smooth stone. What's wrong with granite?
Nemu. Dude, just tell me so I can give you the goods. She watched as the text bubble popped up, only to disappear again. This repeated. Again. And again. And again. She sat up properly, swinging her legs over Sushi to focus fully on that little bubble. The feline meowed softly before curling up. Shota.
Midoriya has never gotten a grief for his mother.
Oh, hon. She recalled the hurried and near-hovering watch even she had been dragged into over the past week at school. The Jap bubble wavered for a few more moments before the next message came in. Shota.
He's never gotten to say goodbye, and he's working himself to death in the thought that it will give him the chance to do so. I just want him to rest. I know his mother would too.
Her heart sank. This must be something Aizawa was far too deeply familiar with. She remembered the aftermath very well. The way that when her lower-classmen friends were suddenly one less, dark wavy hair became messy and unkempt. Hands bruised and wrapped to hide the abrasions from rough and unrefined materials that he was still learning to use. The exhaustion and bare minimums he skated on for the rest of the year. Her and Izashi had worked hard to make sure that their friend survived. She pet a sleeping Sushi with one hand as she considered all the stores she frequented. It was a mostly comprehensive list of stores, stones, cuts, and sizes by the time she sent it. Nemu. Would you like me to come with? Shota.
No. Thank you, Namori.
Aizawa watched closely as Izuku leapt back from Suyu's attempt to place another sticker on him. It was the boy's idea, and to be fair, it was a clever way to keep track. Today was a game of keep-away, so to speak. They were in a private gym on campus, and Izuku was flicking his antenna, which had 3 stickers on them collectively. The goal of the game was to get him to be more aware of how his larger body gave him both more options in a fight, but also way more openings he would have to learn to defend. Tsuyu was using her smaller size and the enclosed space as a way to optimize both getting around Izuku and into his blind spots. Aizawa's job was supposed to be monitoring that there wasn't too much stress being put onto either student. He was distracted, though, as he tried to figure out how to best approach the mess he was about to agitate. He stepped out of the way as Izuku twisted sharply out of Tsuyu's hands. Where his tail would have missed hitting him, the quills would not have. They would have to figure out how to adjust that one. The best way Aizawa could figure out his issue was just to be direct with it. He could do damage control on the way down. He hadn't even wanted to be the one to do it, but he understood after thinking about it. He was almost angry about it at first, the way Yagi refused to do the whole thing himself. Financially, Yagi had covered every last bit of it. His reasoning for not physically handling it, though, eventually felt sound. Yagi wasn't stepping completely out on this one, just back. It was fair, regrettably. He had wanted to give Izuku both the option of privacy and, on top of that, the security of not having to explain the same emotionally exhausting thing over and over. To add even more to it, Izuku very clearly still held Yagi in very high regards, even with their closeness taken into account. After all the trust they had built together, Yagi feared Izuku would not allow himself the mental ease of dropping his guard, that he wouldn't cease the act of being a desirable student to keep. Yagi was afraid that there would be no reprieve, no intermission where Izuku could simply be and grieve. He would, without a doubt, be there at a moment's notice if asked. He would not leave the kid he clearly viewed so fondly. He just would not invade the space Aizawa had been working to set up unwarranted. The timer they had set to give the two enough time to clean up and change back, Izuku needing the cleanup whereas Tsuyu needed the changing room, finally rang out. They both stopped, and Izuku took the time with Tsuyu to go over himself and count all the stickers. He changed to back before taking them off, though. He hadn't wanted to rip at his antenna for the most part. The two behaved acceptably, and Tsuyu truly just had more questions than concerns or fears. After she had seen he was not the same as at USJ, it was a clear curiosity. She said farewell as she hurried to the locker rooms, and Aizawa stepped forward to pull a sticker from the back of Izuku's hair.
Hey, I wanted to tell you that
Aizawa held the sticker out.
this was a very clever idea. I wanted to talk to you more, but schedules today are disagreeing. Nothing is wrong. You're okay, and everything will be alright. I just figured we would talk when we get home.
It felt like lies, even though it wasn't. Izuku took the sticker and, still performing whatever act he couldn't let go of, smiled brightly. It was artificial at best.
Okay, Aizawa-sensei.
And he was gone. It had to stop. One should never push themselves through kindness at the expense of their own health. He turned to look around the gym floor. He had noticed it shortly after the session began, but seeing it all settled, he dropped his face into the nest of gear he wore. There was dark gray fur all over. It practically dusted the floor. This isn't healthy. His usual strolling pace home was replaced by an aggravated and hasty stride. He couldn't have known that some of the girls would decide to drop in at the end of the day to petition usage for 2 of the gyms. It was good in terms of their focus on preparing for the midterms. It just also meant that Izuku was undoubtedly spiraling in their home. It wasn't how he had wanted this to start. He knew Izuku had everything he needed to be alright physically while waiting. It was the absolutely abysmal mental place he was in that had him near running down the last stretch of road to his door. He was trusting Izuku to be okay with his unplanned gap of undisturbed solitude. He's trusting him to not be injured. He's worried what it will be that he walks into as he turns the key in the lock. The first thing he hears is the news at a low volume. That was a good thing. Izuku did that to have background noise when he was trying to keep himself occupied. He didn't want to stress Izuku any further and was quick to take off his boots. He took his bag along with him, though, as he found his student staring at the screen with blank homework spread on the table. Izuku's knees were tucked under his chin as he watched the weather scroll for the next few days. Aizawa didn't let himself sigh, instead taking a measured breath so as to not give Izuku any reason to dig up phantoms of disappointment that weren't there. He just wished he had gotten home soon enough to prevent this unnecessary anxiety. He sat down in his usual spot across from Izuku, finding his cushion already pulled out instead of tucked under the table like normal. He set his bag on the table and started to pull out all the things he had been discreetly purchasing since he messaged Nemuri. They had gone back and forth on some of the stone types, but they did eventually settle on a polished blue stone for the slab he purchased. It wasn't that big, but it was a proper size for what he planned. It was unorthodox for how these things usually went, but he knew some sort of release was needed for this. Izuku dragged his gaze from the screen to each of the items Aizawa pulled out. A small dish, a tiny solar-powered fountain, which was a generous name for it, but it would keep the water he purchased from becoming dirty due to standing. A rather absurdly small ladle, one he wouldn't have ever found if Nomuri hadn't texted him exactly where to find it. Incense and a burner, along with a small lighter. Then finally a small vase that could be secured into soil if it needed to be. They sat quietly together for a bit, Izuku taking the time to quietly inspect the items without touching. Aizawa waited for him to initiate the conversation. If Izuku was still in his head, he would end up repeating himself, and ever since this specific mindset of his started, that would lead to a series of apologies that took a while to settle. It hurt nothing for them to stay in their relatively comfortable silence.
It's supposed to be scattered showers on Thursday.
Izuku started their conversation small. That was fine. He could lead the conversation however he wanted.
Hopefully it clears up in time for us to have a dry run. I know you mentioned wanting to go towards the mountains next time.
He watched as Izuku finally reached out and picked up the fountain.
Have you been there at night? There's some pretty stars if it isn't cloudy.
He turned it over in his hands, running his nail over the residue that the removed sticker had left behind.
Not in a touristic manner, no. I think the last time I was out that way was for a class I was preparing for.
Izuku chewed on that information for a bit.
Shinzo mentioned wanting to go to a planetarium sometime together. I had to look it up, but I think it would be cool to show him the real stars outside of the city, if he likes them.
He held out the fountain for Aizawa to take back.
We can set up a time to go out other than on our runs, you know. It wouldn't be a problem.
Aizawa accepted it and put it back on the table. He didn't really understand this specific routine yet. It was shortly after their grocery shopping trips upgraded to basket use that it started. Izuku would hand things to him to set down or put away when he was having quieter days. It was a pointed interaction, though. Aizawa couldn't help but wonder if it was just a way for Izuku to reaffirm that someone else was there, that he wasn't alone. He also had debated if it was a reversion of sorts to habits he no longer consciously remembered, mostly because it was reminiscent of how a child would help their parents put away things, since they were often too small to reach many of the places items went. A return to how his life in a home had been. Psychology was not one of his strong suits, though, so we couldn't be sure of either or both. Izuku picked up the ladle. When his breathing hiccuped only a bit, Aizawa knew he had puzzled it out.
I wanted to ask you if you have had time to properly mourn for your mother, Midoriya.
He watched as Izuku's grip flexed on the handle, ever careful to not damage things, but still fighting the impulse to grip his hands. After a few moments, Izuku shook his head no. He was tense. His eyes said he was expecting some sort of scolding, even as he gingerly handed the ladle back to him. Aizawa set it back down next to the fountain. Thankfully, Aizawa didn't need to say any verbal reassurances. Izuku took a few breaths and slowly relaxed his muscles. He was taking the time to settle himself.
I think it might help you if you had the chance to. It's not giving up to grieve something, but it can help with a lot to give yourself the space to do so.
He watched Izuku run a hand over the stone slab.
Things are different now. You aren't fighting to keep yourself at bare minimum survival on the streets anymore. You have a home here. If you would like, I think it is time you had the chance to grieve for her.
The pause from there is long. He doesn't press. This isn't going to work like it should if he forced Izuku into anything. This had to be on his terms. If he said no, Aizawa would put the things away and they would wait until he was ready. The news filled their silence as Izuku continued to practically pet the stone.
I don't know where the family grave is.
Izuku's voice was hoarse. It was barely even a whisper. Aizawa had expected as much. It was why he had gone through the effort of purchasing all of these things. Money had been far from his concerns in relation to it, and not because he wasn't paying for it, but because he only wanted what was best. The pseudo-grave shrine blend he had settled on was something he had come up with in a meeting, honestly. Wherever they put it up, it would have to be sort of hidden to prevent it from being taken down.
That's okay. We can set it up wherever you would like to put it.
He took the slab when Izuku picked it up to hand to him.
Okay.
We can do this whenever you'd like. There was no rush.
Aizawa put the things Izuku had already looked at back into his bag. He waited and slowly put the rest away as they were handed to him. When the last thing, the vase, was finally handed to him and put away, Izuku looked at his homework on the table and sighed.
Is any of it due tomorrow?
He asked.
The English grammar is.
Izashi will give you extra time, if you want it. The rest can wait if you do want to do this today.
Izuku nodded slowly.
Are we getting fake flowers?
Izuku picked up the remote and held it in his lap, eyes going back to the screen.
It's typical to do so, but we can get real ones and replace them regularly, if you would like.
Okay.
Aizawa turned to watch the news with him. It was another 20 minutes before Izuku turned off the television and started to put away his untouched homework. Another 15 for him to be near the door and putting on his shoes. Aizawa followed him wordlessly. He was locking the door behind them when Yamada opened his door.
Hey, I'm gonna leave my door unlocked, so you can come grab Marble tonight if you want, alright?
He was leaning out the frame and smiled a little at Izuku.
I'll also be here if you need me.
Izuku smiled, a small and wobbly thing, and Yamada ducked back into his home. Aizawa doesn't have to bother with his previously frequent phrases and promptings to lead the way all that much anymore. The walk is rather pleasant, one he would have called enjoyable if not for the circumstances. Izuku paused about 20 minutes out. He was in front of a small shop that had cheap flowers and arrangements.
Don't think about the cost for this, Midoriya.
Aizawa stood at his shoulder. People threaded around them on the sidewalk.
I don't know any other stores,
he mumbled.
Do you want me to find some?
They watched someone pay at the register through the window.
Maybe next time?
Izuku looked at him. Well, he looked over his shoulder.
All right.
He followed Izuku into the shop. When they were checking out, Izuku only had 2 flowers. He didn't insist Izuku grab more. This was something for Izuku. It needed to be done however Izuku felt was doing it right. The next stop was a beach. Arguably, it could have been the apartment complex Izuku hesitated near before walking faster, but they actually stopped at the rails right before the beach. For his memory, this specific stretch had a notorious status as a dump. What he saw, though, was remarkably spotless. The sun was starting to hang low. There was no rush.
Can we get the stone etched? Or can I etch it later?
Izuku asked.
Of course.
The waves were peaceful. A group of teens were walking near the water, chattering away.
I want to write Okasan on it.
Aizawa pushed down the way that made his heart ache. It wasn't his time to relive his own grief.
We could even do both, if you want.
They stood there for a while longer, Izuku looking around and Aizawa watching him indirectly. He noticed that the moment Izuku settled on something, the whole set of his body shifted a bit when he had. He led Aizawa on to a different place. It was more in town, but the park they entered had a few areas with somewhat thicker trees and shrubs. Some of the shrubs hugged close to one particular tree, and Izuku was rather direct on his path to that spot in particular.
Here.
Aizawa pulled his bag around and removed the stone first. He didn't want to personally set any of it himself, but after Izuku placed the actual slab, he was quick to notice how badly the boy's hands were shaking. He knelt down next to Izuku and pulled out the next thing he could reach.
Just tell me where you would like it.
It takes only a minute for them to wordlessly put the small pseudo-shrine together. It had ended up in a vaguely traditional layout. What Aizawa didn't expect, after securing the vase behind the slab, was the way Izuku handed him one of the 2 flowers. His brows twitched towards each other in confusion.
You had known she was missing.
Izuku held the flower he kept reverently.
Did you look for her?
Aizawa accepted the flower. He had. At least he tried to, armed only with his young and inexperienced skills.
I did my best. I was young.
Izuku placed his flower in the vase.
So was I.
He grit his teeth as he nestled his flower next to Izuku's. It was something he had tried his best not to think too long about. The foolish and self-defeatist guilt that dredged up with the thought of how long Izuku had been alone. The entire hole-riddled system that continued to fail so many while boasting the title of heroic. It was something many of the actual good heroes struggle with. The ones they miss. The ones that are failed. Izuku was holding one of the incense sticks and looking at the setup blankly. His hands were still shaking. His breath was starting to as well. As Aizawa realized Izuku didn't seem to actually know what to typically do next, he took the lead. He knew the general routines from Oban and the few times he had very rarely visited family graves. So he led by example. Izuku was lagging in his following, but it was to be expected. This was a funeral of sorts, for the one thing Izuku had left. His last remnant of his life he held dear. He was burying the likely already buried memories he could no longer reach. Aizawa closed his eyes and offered a short prayer to gods he had long felt had abandoned him and all those he knew. Heroes often tempted fates. Gods did not protect the foolhardy. Yet, if Nezu's bold claims were true down to their essence about Izuku, when he opened his eyes he set the incense in his hand along with a few others into the holder. He ensured they were all smoldering. When he glanced to the side, Izuku's eyes were still closed. Tears were streaming and he was clearly struggling to keep his mouth straight. His chin was quivering as he fought down the way his body was trying to cry. Aizawa didn't comment and went back to watching the incense burn. The sun set as Aizawa let his mind wander to give Izuku his time he wanted. The time he needed. It started to fully settle in his mind that this troublesome and desperately giving child had literally been gripping onto ghosts of memories. They were his sole fuel for survival. The feed that kept him going was the desire to apologize to his mother for not being good enough. For Izuku, this was a grief that would not settle easily. In those moments of thought, Aizawa hated her, almost viciously. It settled, though, when he remembered the photos he had prepared for Izuku. It was in the eyes. Midoriya Inko had not left intentionally. He felt that this was the truth, even without the evidence to prove it. It was illogical. He would have scoffed if someone else had said it. Yet here he was with the thought on his own. It is a long while before Izuku opened his eyes. Most of the incense had burned out in the holder already, and the one in Izuku's hand had as well. The soot was piled on his knee.
Can I take a picture?
Izuku asked, voice raw, without looking away from the spread.
You can do whatever you'd like. This is for you.
He accepted the stub of a stick that Izuku offered and tucked it into the holder. He watched with a stronger protective draw than he could recall ever having before, as Izuku's shivering hands tried to steady for a single photo. Izuku was still crying.
Izuku.
He reached forward and gently removed the phone from his hands. It was released willingly.
I want to print it. To have it home.
Home?
We could pick up a frame in the morning.
He centered the display and took the photo. He took a moment to send it to himself as well. He had photo paper at home he could print it onto. They head home after making sure the incense is safely snubbed. Izuku held the phone close to his chest, both hands wrapped around it. He cried in silence as they sat on the train. It was in waves now, the tears. Aizawa placed a hand on his shoulder as he stood next to the seat Izuku was curled up on. At home, Aizawa stayed in the living room as Izuku curled on the couch. In a lot of ways, it was similar to that first night Izuku had stepped into the home. He had his backpack in his lap. The now printed photo of his mother's shrine was in his hand. When he did fall asleep, Aizawa hesitated before he picked him up carefully. Marble was still in Izashi's home, but he would go retrieve her once he was sure Izuku would stay asleep. He carried Izuku to his bed and laid him down, careful not to bump or jostle the photo in his hand. A trip back to the living room was made to retrieve the backpack and place it in his arms. Only after the photo was carefully replaced with Izuku's phone, still set on the same image but also sleeping, did he pull the blanket up. He walked next door and sighed as he entered. "How did it go?" Yamada whispered. Marble was already in his arms.
We have a long way to go, Hisashi.
He pet Marble and let his partner pull him forward enough to give him a hug with his free arm.
He's already been doing better. You're more capable than you think you are with this.
We both know recovery isn't linear, nor is it pretty.
And you know that better than anyone else I know.
Yamada pulled back and pressed Marble into his arms.
She chirruped brightly. You don't want him to wake up alone.
I'll talk to you tomorrow,
he said and bumped his forehead to Yamada's gently.
You know where to find me, Shell.
Yamada's smile was warm and supportive. It always was. He exchanged simple goodnights and hurried back into his own home. He set Marble down on Izuku's bed and she curled up against the back of his neck. Her purring could be heard from the doorway as he paused to watch Izuku for a few breaths. He watched his elbow lift and fall slightly with each breath. No hitching, no hiccups. He walked back over to the bed again to adjust the photo. He set it so that it stood up on the nightstand instead of lying flat. Comfort was needed tonight. Izuku would wake up more reassured of the photo's safety if he could see it immediately. He worried for the kid. This would be good for him, though. Everyone needed to learn how to say goodbye to another without also saying goodbye to parts of themselves.